This next question asks you to determine who is responsible for Mr. Redburn's cancer. Mr. Pataka admitted in jury selection, he told you again this morning, he admits that Mr. Redburn is partially at fault. Partially at fault. And I think he told you this morning he thinks that's about 5 to 10%. About 5 to 10% at fault. When you look at the jury instructions, you'll see that this assignment relates only to the actions that were a legal cause of Mr. Redburn's cancer and death. And you might not have understood that from Mr. Pataka's argument, but that is the narrow inquiry here. Comparative fault is not some global comparison of everything Mr. Redburn did over the course of his life versus everything Reynolds did. That's not the question that you're being asked here. It's much more narrow than that. So the issue here is, did something Reynolds do impact Mr. Redburn? If it didn't, then it can't be considered for this question. Despite Mr. Pataka's suggestion, just because Mr. Redburn was born in 1942, that did not mean that he would smoke his entire life, and that's just the way it was. We've seen and heard time and again that millions of people made a different decision at key points in time. You know about the 1964 Surgeon General's report. You've heard a lot about that. You heard about that when Dr. Cummings came to testify. This was the landmark report where the Surgeon General concluded that cigarette smoking causes cancer in men. This is 1964. Shortly thereafter, in 1966, you know the first warning label went on packs and cartons of cigarettes. From 1966 to 1970, that 4-year period alone, 13 million people quit smoking. 13 million. We know Mr. Redburn wasn't trying to quit during that time period. Pam Bush and John Hennessy, his former brother-in-law, they told you that Mr. Redburn wasn't even talking about quitting. Dr. Cummings actually puts this in his Smart Move pamphlet. I think you saw this when Mr. Reynolds stood up to talk to Dr. Cummings. This is that stop smoking contract that he asks smokers to sign. It says, I am fully responsible for this decision and aware that my commitment to this change is of primary importance. I am fully responsible. There is no asterisk there that says you're only partially responsible if you were born in Mr. Redburn's birth cohort. There's no qualifier that says, well, if you started smoking when athletes advertise cigarettes, you're not fully responsible. Dr. Cummings is telling smokers today, you are fully responsible for the decision to stop. And that stands to reason. Dr. Cummings told you no one can make that decision for you. You have to make that decision for yourself. If you know you should quit like Mr. Redburn did, and you don't want to, that's fine. That's fine, but you're 100% responsible for the consequences of that smoking. Another way to think about this is that when Mr. Redburn was a daily drinker, whether he was home after a long day at work or out with friends like Darryl Wilbanks, Mr. Redburn didn't take 5 to 10% responsibility for what he drank. If you know what you're doing and you don't want to stop, you're 100% responsible for those decisions. This question isn't about blame. It's about personal responsibility. So if you get to this point on the verdict form, I ask you to recognize that personal responsibility for one's own health is not a negotiable term. Mr. Redburn was not responsible for only some parts of his life, or only some of his health choices, whether it was drinking or smoking or his diet or something else. He made those choices, and he is responsible for those choices. I ask you to recognize personal responsibility. I ask you to assign 100% of the responsibility to Mr. Redburn for his smoking decisions.